There is a wonderful vignette that appears in Homer's classic work, The Odyssey, about Odysseus, the cunning Odysseus. And for those more advanced, James Joyce provides an interesting twist in his work, Ulysses. Same story, but different telling, detailing the meanderings around Dublin of Leopold Bloom, the everyman. But they may be one of those great works on the bucket list or just too long, didn't read it for some. So let me provide the revised standard modern synopsis of this scene called The Island of the Lotus Eaters. You are in a car. No, the whole country is in the car. And you are on a trip to the wonderful world of Disney without any pandemic. Wonderful stuff. But since you were in a car, you have to stop at a rest stop to refill your tank because your car can't run forever. Refresh yourself, take care of your business, and do whatever else you do when you stop at a rest stop. But when you get to the gas station, you find out that they have really great food, great souvenirs, great games. And you forget all about your trip to the Magic Kingdom because you were having such a wonderful time at the rest stop getting gas. Pretty simple here to understand a principle in economics called opportunity costs. In quid pro quo exchange, no, we're not having a bribe, in quid pro quo exchange for your decision to enjoy 5 wonderful days in Orlando with Mickey Mouse and the wonderful cast of attractions, you got a vacation at a gas stop. Door number 2 you chose. Are we clear? Your choice. And now, when your highly educated friends make an allusion to the works of Homer, you can interject your take on the Lotus Eaters. Bonus. If you are the beneficiary of a college education with a liberal arts curriculum, you may not have read the definitive book on mercantilism and free market economics, The Wealth of Nations. But you may have heard the sentence by Adam Smith that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. Describing a market theory that is known to economists as the invisible hand theory, which has nothing to do with fomite infections or being contaminated indirectly by surfaces. And this is probably an appropriate time within a pandemic fight against an invisible enemy, finding that the alarm expressed by scientists at Oxford University and even at WHO early in the pandemic about politicians and journalists not reading the science reports appears not yet to have been shared approaching the anniversary of a novel coronavirus that has changed the world. The Encyclopedia Britannica describes the invisible hand as a metaphor introduced by the 18th century Scottish philosopher and economist Adam Smith that characterizes the mechanisms through which beneficial social and economic outcomes may arise from the accumulated self-interested actions of individuals, none of whom intends to bring about such outcomes. The notion of the invisible hand has been employed in economics and other social sciences to explain the division of labor, the emergence of medium of exchange, the growth of wealth, the patterns such as price levels manifest in the market competition and the institutions and rules of society. More controversially, it has been used to argue that free markets made up of economic agents who act in their own self-interest deliver the best possible social and economic outcomes. That is the invisible hand, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. Generally, you will find those who ascribe to socialism and Marxism rejecting the free market views of persons like Adam Smith and even myself, because to them the idea that people act within the constraints of their own selfish interests is simply not the way that the world should be. Or at least that is what the way that it has been sold to people who probably never even performed the prerequisite reading for the course. So let's, like academics, take an ivory tower look at these opposing economic theories from a freshened perspective in what we have witnessed with our own eyes. in a pandemic crisis today, responsible for claiming the lives of over 250,000, almost 270,000 Americans, and over 4,000 Virginians. And that is probably a good figure with which to begin, because from just about day one, we have known that COVID-19 can actually kill people. And we have known that the population most vulnerable to fatalities are the elderly residing in nursing homes, particularly if they have a history of age-related pre-existing medical conditions. And they today represent our highest fatalities, over 60%. But did you notice that the attention in the press until just before a big election, first during the primaries, and later during the general election, and now as we press through a contested result of that election, has not been on the fatalities count, but rather on the lowest priority in a public health crisis representing the infections of a pathogen from which most will develop at most mild symptoms like pneumonia, if anything at all. If the world was as simple as socialists and Marxists describe it, wouldn't a multi-millionaire real estate mogul like a certain man in the White House be the first interested in making money on products like facial coverings, medical grade, personnel protective equipment, and vaccinations like the ones that Dr. Fauci approves of funding? You recall Fauci, the guy who cared so much about his grandkids that he decided not to spend Thanksgiving with his grandkids. Yet we find in a pandemic these incentives, these very incentives, apparently reversed on all empirical evidence. The casino and entertainment mogul, who is only concerned about money, has actually been notorious for rejecting the products marketed in the trillion-dollar mask business. And of late, there are even some folks blaming him for standing in the way of the profits of the pharmaceutical companies who are trying to help us with the immediate delivery of vaccinations that have been rushed through testing, and about which we will not know for years the long-term effects. An objection actually most vigorously advocated by Dr. Fauci back in the 1980s, when some believed that treatments for AIDS should have been rushed through the approval process. Suddenly, the world looks a little different through our fashioned masks about which nobody knows or admits to know why they became political. How about yourself? Have you been the paragon of social justice virtue in pandemic, and any better than those free market advocates? If you work as a public health professional, when you go out to the front lines, are you sure that you have properly fitted your N95 mask, medical grade? Do you know that the ventilator that filters out 95% of nanoparticles in your breathable air only works one way, to protect you, and that 100% of your potentially infectious particles spew right through that same aperture onto everyone around you? Is that very caring? Did you know, as a scientist, why we took the time a decade ago at the NIOSH to test substitutes for PPE in the event of a pandemic? Was because we knew that we had to do something to protect essential workers from non-essential folks like yourself hoarding critical medical supplies. Did you know that as late as March, the CDC was actually publishing guidelines like canceling elective surgeries and withdrawing N95 masks from visitor areas to help medical professionals deny you medical grade protection? Did you know that in the Commonwealth of Virginia, it is a felony for you to actually be out in the public with an N95 mask, because those are reserved for essential workers? Did you know that fully knowing that substitutes for medical grade protection had failed the same test on the same equipment that we use to rate the medical grade protection, the World Health Organization actually invested in an extensive rush review of 172 observational, non-peer-reviewed, no double-blind study homemade tests on PPE substitutes back in June? Because we all know from experience that if your car fails the inspection, the right thing to do is to simply change the test until you find a test your car can pass, right? Did you know that even with those tests, they still couldn't find a way to get your facial covering to pass that test? But news reporters at the Washington Post actually published a story that they syndicated in other papers to make sure everyone else could read it all around the country, with a big, bold headline, that only part of a news story that most people read, that claimed that a spate of new research supports wearing masks on the hopes that you would just read the headline and go out immediately to support the trillion-dollar mask industry and not read the caveat buried 5 paragraphs down that they don't work. That they don't work. Indeed, comrades, workers of the world, unite. And I dub thee fill in the blank. Just remember that the only thing that Adam Smith said was, it is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests. But that does not mean that we don't thereby still reap something of value that will accrue a benefit to ourselves, or that they are of necessity bad people. Just like the guy riding alone in a car with a facial covering on his face, wholly unaware that even the CDC will tell him that the piece of cotton dummy corded to his head only creates a simple barrier to prevent his potentially infectious medium to large droplet from infecting others, and does nothing for himself except provide a huge COVID catcher on his face, like a kid wearing a snot guard shield hat, wholly unaware of the way it works. Despite several trips to feast on vegetables and greeny things at the salad bar, everyone has a self-interest, accentuated in times of danger. And even businesses will go out of business if they fail to perform the due diligence to fully inform themselves about the market in which they operate and are competing, developing a sustainable business model. Now, almost a year since the emergence of a pneumonia of unknown etiology. And if that is a novel phrase to you, don't worry about it, because we are way past that point in the course. If you failed to read the most extensive study on a novel coronavirus before lockdown, let me provide the brief highlights to kind of get you up to speed, like Cliff Notes, that may help you to pass this test. First, the World Health Organization, back in February, and teams of at least 5 epidemiologists could find no evidence that an infectious or communicable disease exists. That's a necessary finding to lock down anything or mandate anything. And you should know that. You should know that. Just like the word pandemic does not connote a universal condition, just because you see mass infections does not of necessity equate to the conclusion that a disease is being transmitted from person to person. Second, and this builds upon the first big finding that you may have missed, they did, however, determine that mass infections demonstrated a high correlation to specific locations. Let that process for a second. Not an infectious disease, and in one location. Think about that. Think about that. It's important. It's important. Third, they specifically told every nation not to lock down, reiterated the guidance in an interview in early March, and repeated that same morning just before state governors decided to do it again after the election. Totally ignored that guidance. And finally, the highly recommended, in fact, it was so important that they stated it 3 times, protect the elderly in nursing homes. And they even published on the internet a resource page to tell your governors and mayors and elected officials exactly how to do that. But for some reason, the man the press calls the leading infectious disease expert, even though that is not actually his job, insisted the president lock down against the specific recommendations of the World Health Organization, and told everyone to wear facial coverings to protect themselves, masks that were determined in the Obama administration a decade ago would not work to protect you, and essentially useless if, as all evidence indicates, COVID-19 is being transmitted as an aerosol, little tiny particles, because just one SARS-CoV-2 particle is at least 6 times larger than the active, smaller than the active ingredient in tear gas. Smaller than the active ingredient in tear gas. And we had a recent experience during the summer in terms of tear gas, and we know tear gas is bad. And if your mask, your little facial covering does not stop that, a little tinier particle is not going to be stopped by that mask. You can come up with all of the graphical illustrations in the world. Just think tear gas. Are you safe? If you doubt this information, please feel free to examine the actual science reports, because at least the state Supreme Court of Virginia has determined that these facts were the only facts sufficient to go to trial against Mark Herring, who has boasted at least 15 victories against law firms in challenges to the lockdown order. And I possess neither a law degree, nor a medical degree, nor a license in either discipline. Live long and prosper, space explorers and comrades. But it's time to come back from Fantasy Island. This is your holiday, your family, your business, your community, your state, your country, and you're supposed to be a grown adult. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for governor of Virginia. I ask every Christian, every conservative, every Republican, every Virginian, and every American to like the motto of the infantry: follow me, and we shall overcome. Honest.
This is advertising.